The chandelier light glinted off Parker Sullivan's expensive watch as he glanced at the time, calculating how quickly he could make his exit from Nate's dinner party. As CEO of Sullivan Marine Industries, Parker had mastered the art of the graceful entrance and the even more graceful exit. 30 minutes. That's all he'd promised his oldest friend, and 25 had already elapsed. The conversation around Nate's expansive dining table buzzed with the usual topics: the newest restaurant openings, vacation destinations, and acquisitions that dominated discussions in their circle. Parker nodded at appropriate intervals while scanning the room for the quickest path to the door. "Parker, you haven't met Danielle yet, have you?" Nate's voice cut through Parker's escape planning. Parker's attention shifted to the far end of the table where a woman sat quietly, her gaze focused on her plate. She wore a simple navy dress, elegant but understated among the flashier outfits in the room. "Danielle Prescott," Nate continued. "She's the new curator at the Maritime Museum." "Danielle, this is Parker Sullivan of Sullivan Marine." The woman looked up, and Parker felt an unexpected jolt when their eyes met. She had the most remarkable eyes, deep blue like the ocean he'd spent his life studying and building vessels to cross. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Sullivan," she said with a small smile. "Parker, please," he replied automatically. "Danielle just moved here from Boston," Nate's wife, Melissa, added. "She's brilliant, wrote the definitive book on New England's maritime history." Parker raised his eyebrows, genuinely interested for the first time that evening. "I may have read your work, Charting the Atlantic." Surprise flickered across Danielle's face. "Yes, that's mine. I wouldn't have expected the CEO of a shipbuilding company to read academic texts." "I find it helps to understand the history of what you're trying to build for the future," Parker replied, surprised by his own earnestness. As the conversation around them resumed, Parker found himself lingering, his planned exit forgotten. When dessert was served, he discovered he'd somehow moved to sit across from Danielle, drawn to her quiet intelligence and the way she really listened when others spoke. "So what brought you to our coastal town?" Parker asked as he declined a serving of chocolate soufflé. "The museum position, primarily, but I've always loved the water." She glanced out the window toward the darkened bay. "There's something about being near the ocean that feels like home." "I know exactly what you mean," Parker said, realizing with surprise that he meant it. When the evening finally drew to a close, Parker found himself reluctant to leave. He exchanged numbers with Danielle under the pretense of offering her a tour of his shipyard, telling himself it was simply professional courtesy for Nate's new friend. 3 days later, Parker stood outside the Maritime Museum, questioning his decision to show up unannounced. CEOs didn't typically make impulsive visits to museums on Tuesday afternoons, but he'd been unable to focus on anything but their conversation since Nate's dinner party. The museum was quiet, only a few visitors wandering the exhibits. Parker found Danielle in the newly renovated whaling exhibit making notes on a clipboard. She looked up at his approach, surprise and something else, pleasure, crossing her face. "Mr. Sullivan, I wasn't expecting you." "Parker," he corrected gently. "I was in the area for a meeting and thought I'd see if you had time for coffee, to welcome you to town properly." It wasn't entirely true. He'd rescheduled 3 meetings to be in the area. "That's very kind of you," she said, tucking a strand of chestnut hair behind her ear. "But I really shouldn't, just coffee," Parker insisted. 20 minutes. Consider it your civic duty to humor our town's business leaders." A smile tugged at her lips. "Is that how you usually get your way?" "By making your desires sound like other people's obligations," Parker laughed, caught off guard by her perception. "Usually it works better than this." "I have 30 minutes before my next meeting," she conceded. "There's a cafe across the street that makes decent espresso." The decent espresso turned into an hour-long conversation about maritime preservation, the challenges of running a global business while maintaining environmental standards, and their shared love of the classics. "So you're not what I expected," Danielle admitted as they walked back to the museum. "What did you expect?" the typical CEO, all numbers and networking, more interested in connections than conversation. Parker studied her profile, fascinated by the frankness in her expression. "And what am I instead?" "I haven't decided yet," she replied with a small smile. "But I'm intrigued enough to find out." Parker hadn't dated seriously in years. His last relationship had ended when Angela had finally grown tired of competing with his company for attention. Since then, he'd confined himself to the occasional dinner with women who understood the limitations of his lifestyle. But something about Danielle was different. She wasn't impressed by his wealth or position. In fact, she seemed slightly suspicious of it, as though his success might somehow indicate a character flaw. Their coffee meetings became a regular occurrence. Once a week turned into twice, and Parker found himself looking forward to their conversations with an eagerness that both confused and exhilarated him. "You've been distracted lately," commented Henry, Parker's CFO, during a budget meeting. "Good distracted, though." "Less likely to bite our heads off over minor issues," Parker frowned. "I have not been distracted. You approved the new employee wellness program without a single question about ROI, Henry pointed out, and you've left the office before 7 3 times this week." Parker shuffled his papers, uncomfortable with the observation. "I'm delegating more, like you've been suggesting for years." "Right," Henry grinned. "Nothing to do with the historian I've heard you're meeting for coffee." Parker shot him a warning look. "Don't you have projections to review?" That evening, Parker called Danielle with an idea that had been forming since their last meeting. "How would you feel about seeing my shipyard? You mentioned wanting to understand modern shipbuilding for your new exhibit." "I'd like that," she said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. The tour was scheduled for Saturday morning. Parker arrived early, uncharacteristically nervous as he waited in the lobby of Sullivan Marine Industries' flagship shipyard. The facility employed over 500 workers and was responsible for building some of the most advanced vessels in the world. But today, it felt less important than making sure Danielle was impressed. She arrived precisely on time, dressed in jeans and a white button-down shirt, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked out of place in the sleek corporate lobby but perfectly at ease as she extended her hand. "This is quite a facility," she said, glancing around at the architectural models of ships that line the walls. "Wait until you see the actual construction," Parker replied. "Ready for the tour." For the next 2 hours, Parker guided Danielle through the massive facility, explaining the process from design to completion. Her questions were insightful, focused on both the technical aspects and the human element of shipbuilding. "What I love," she said as they watched a team working on the hull of a research vessel, "is that despite all the technology, it still comes down to skilled hands doing the work." Parker nodded. "That's what my father always emphasized. The technology changes, but the craftsmanship is timeless." "Your father built the company," started with one small boatyard. "I was 12 when he bought this property. We lived in a trailer on site for the first year while he reinvested every penny into equipment." "That's not the silver spoon story I expected," Danielle admitted, disappointed. Parker asked, only half joking. "The opposite, actually." She met his eyes directly. "It explains a lot about you." The tour ended at the water's edge where one of Sullivan's newest vessels, a sleek 60-foot yacht, was docked. "This is the Horizon," Parker said, unable to hide the pride in his voice. "She's our most efficient design, yet 40% less fuel consumption than comparable models." "She's beautiful," Danielle murmured, running her hand along the polished rail. "Would you like to see how she handles?" Danielle looked surprised. "You mean take her out?" "Now, why not? She's fueled up and ready for a demonstration cruise scheduled for Monday." An hour later, they were 5 miles offshore, the coastline a distant line on the horizon. Parker stood at the helm, feeling more relaxed than he had in months. Beside him, Danielle leaned against the railing, her face turned into the wind. "I can see why you do this," she called over the sound of the engines. "It's freedom, isn't it?" Parker cut back on the throttle, letting the yacht settle into a gentle cruise. That's exactly it. No matter how complicated business gets, this feeling makes sense. They anchored in a sheltered cove and shared the lunch. Parker had arranged fresh seafood and crisp wine that they ate on the upper deck. "So tell me," Parker said as they finished the meal, "why maritime history? What drew you to it?" Danielle's expression softened. "My grandfather was a fisherman. He used to take me out on his boat when I was little, tell me stories about the sea. After he died, I started researching those stories, separating fact from his rather creative fiction." She smiled at the memory. "I discovered I had a talent for the research, and it felt like a way to keep his stories alive. He would be proud of you." "I hope so." She glanced at Parker. "What about you? Did you always want to take over the family business?" Parker considered the question. "Not always. I went through a rebellious phase, thought I'd become a lawyer just to spite my father." "What changed your mind?" "My father got sick my junior year of college. Lymphoma. He recovered, but it was a wake-up call. I realized the business wasn't just his legacy, it was something we built together. All those summers I worked in the yard." Parker rarely shared these details, but something about Danielle made it easy. "I changed my major to business and engineering, worked my way through every department in the company. And now you're the CEO." "Now I'm the CEO," Parker agreed, "though some days I'd rather just be out here." As they sailed back to port, the conversation flowed as easily as it had from their first meeting. By the time they docked, the sun was setting, casting long golden rays across the water. "Thank you for today," Danielle said as they walked back to her car. "It was unexpected." "In a good way, I hope." She stopped and turned to face him. "In a very good way." The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility. Parker stepped closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. "Danielle," he said softly, "I'd like to see you again. Not for coffee, not for a museum consult, a proper date." Her eyes searched his face. "Are you sure that's a good idea? We live in very different worlds, Parker." "We're standing in the same one right now," he said. "That seems like enough to start with." A smile slowly spread across her face. "Dinner tomorrow night? I'll pick you up at 7. The restaurant Parker chose was elegant but not ostentatious, a small Italian place where the owner greeted them personally and led them to a private table overlooking the harbor. "You look beautiful," Parker said as they were seated. Danielle wore a simple black dress that set off her fair skin and dark hair, which fell in soft waves around her shoulders. "Thank you. You clean up pretty well yourself." There was a slight nervousness to her smile that Parker found endearing. The meal was excellent, but Parker barely noticed the food. He was captivated by the way Danielle's eyes lit up when she spoke about her work, the thoughtful questions she asked about his, and the comfortable silences that fell between topics. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," Danielle challenged as they lingered over dessert. Parker raised an eyebrow. "That's a dangerous request. I'll make it fair. You tell me something, then I'll tell you something." Parker considered. "I hate boats." Danielle nearly choked on her wine. "What? But you build them?" "I don't hate all boats," Parker clarified with a laugh. "I hate recreational speedboats, the kind that tear around the harbor with tourists screaming and music blasting. My first job was cleaning those monstrosities every weekend." "That's hardly a deep, dark secret," Danielle teased. "Fine, something real." Parker took a breath. "I'm terrified of failing, not just the business, but at life in general. My father built something meaningful from nothing. I worry that all I'm doing is maintaining it." The humor in Danielle's eyes softened to understanding. "That's very human of you, CEO Sullivan." "Your turn," Parker reminded her. Danielle traced the rim of her glass. "I almost didn't come to Nate's dinner party that night. I'd convinced myself that I didn't belong in a room full of successful people with their perfect lives." "What changed your mind?" "Melissa said there was someone she wanted me to meet." Danielle looked up, meeting his eyes. "I had no idea it would be you." Parker reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "I'm glad you came." The next few weeks passed in a blur of dinners, museum visits, and long walks along the harbor. Parker found himself rearranging meetings and delegating tasks he would normally have handled personally, all to create more time with Danielle. "You're good for him," Henry commented to Danielle at a charity gala where Parker had finally introduced her to his core team. "He's actually using his vacation days this year." "Is that so unusual?" Danielle asked, watching as Parker charmed a group of potential investors across the room. "Let's just say his office couch has seen more overnight stays than his bedroom," Henry replied. Later that night, as they walked along the moonlit promenade, Danielle brought up Henry's comment. "Do you really work that much?" Parker shrugged. "The company needed it. We expanded internationally 5 years ago and the learning curve was steep. And now I'm discovering there are other priorities worth making time for." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "You, for instance?" The kiss, when it finally happened, felt inevitable. Her lips were soft under his, her body fitting perfectly against him as he pulled her closer. When they parted, the look in her eyes mirrored what he was feeling, wonder mixed with a hunger for more. "I've been wanting to do that since that day on the boat," Parker admitted, his voice low. "What took you so long?" Danielle asked with a smile, drawing him down for another kiss. Their relationship deepened over the following months. Parker introduced Danielle to the joys of sailing on vessels larger than her grandfather's fishing boat. She took him to historical sites he'd driven past hundreds of times without truly seeing. "I can't believe this was here all along," Parker said as they explored an old lighthouse keeper's cottage that had been converted into a small museum. "I've lived here my entire life and never knew." "Most people don't see what's right in front of them," Danielle replied. "They're too busy looking toward the horizon." "Are you calling me short-sighted, Dr. Prescott?" Parker teased, pulling her close. "I'm saying you might have missed some local treasures while building your global empire." "Not anymore," he murmured against her hair. Not everything was smooth sailing. Their first argument came 6 months into their relationship when Parker had to cancel their weekend plans for an emergency meeting in Singapore. "I understand it's important," Danielle said, her voice tight with disappointment. "But this is the 3rd time this month, Parker. We had tickets for the symphony." "I'll make it up to you," he promised, already packing his overnight bag. "This client represents a quarter of our Asian market. I can't send someone else." "Can't or won't." The question hung between them, unanswered as Parker rushed to make his flight. In Singapore, distracted and jet-lagged, Parker nearly lost the contract he'd flown 16 hours to save. It was only when the client, an elderly Japanese shipping magnate, asked about his obvious distraction that Parker had a moment of clarity. "You have someone waiting for you at home," the man observed over a late dinner. "Someone important." "Is it that obvious?" Parker asked. The man smiled. "I was young once too. I missed my wife's birthday for a meeting just like this one. 40 years later, she still mentions it." Parker looked down at his watch, a gift from Danielle on his birthday, and made a decision. "Mr. Tanaka, would you mind if we concluded our business tonight? I have somewhere important I need to be." 26 hours, 3 flights, and 1 mad dash from the airport later, Parker slipped into his seat at the symphony just as the lights dimmed. Danielle's surprise turned to joy as she recognized him in the darkness. "You're supposed to be in Singapore," she whispered. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," he replied, taking her hand. That night after the symphony, Parker took Danielle to his home, a modernist structure overlooking the bay that he'd rarely spent time in despite owning it for 5 years. "I've been thinking," he said as they stood on the terrace, the lights of the harbor spread below them, "about priorities, about what really matters." Danielle leaned against him, her warmth a comfort in the cool evening air. "And what have you concluded, Mr. CEO?" "That I want more nights like this, more mornings waking up with you, more of everything that isn't work." He turned to face her. "I love you, Danielle. I think I've loved you since that first coffee." The emotion in her eyes matched his own. "I love you too, Parker. Even when you drive me crazy with your impossible schedule." "I'm working on that," he promised. "Starting now." True to his word, Parker began restructuring his role at Sullivan Marine, promoting key team members and establishing clear boundaries between work and personal time. The company didn't suffer. If anything, the fresh perspectives from his leadership team brought new energy to projects Parker had been micromanaging. 1 year after they met, Parker took Danielle back to the cove where they'd anchored on their first boat trip. This time, he'd arranged for a catered dinner on the beach, complete with lanterns and a small bonfire. "This is beautiful," Danielle said as they finished their meal, the stars emerging overhead. "What's the occasion? Do I need an occasion to spoil you?" Parker asked, taking her hand and leading her along the shoreline. "No, but you have that look in your eye, the one you get before making a major business announcement," Parker laughed. "You know me too well." They stopped where the sand met the rocks, the lighthouse visible in the distance. Parker had rehearsed what he wanted to say, but standing here with Danielle, words felt inadequate. "A year ago, I thought I knew exactly what my life was supposed to be," he began. "Work was everything. Success was measurable. And then you walked into Nate's dinner party, and suddenly none of those measurements made sense anymore." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box. "You changed everything, Danielle. You showed me there's more to life than what I can build or buy." He dropped to one knee, opening the box to reveal a ring with a deep blue sapphire surrounded by diamonds. "Will you marry me?" Tears glistened in Danielle's eyes as she nodded. "Yes, yes, of course I will." The ring slid perfectly onto her finger, a fact Parker was secretly proud of, having enlisted Melissa's help to determine the size. "It's the color of the ocean," Danielle said, admiring how the sapphire caught the firelight. "And your eyes. I thought it suited a maritime historian better than a traditional diamond." She kissed him deeply. "It's perfect. You're perfect." They married 6 months later in a ceremony that blended elegance with maritime traditions. The reception was held on the deck of a restored 19th-century sailing ship, a surprise gift from Parker to the museum, secured with Danielle's expert guidance during the restoration process. "To think this all started because Nate insisted I meet his new curator friend," Parker said, as they shared their first dance as husband and wife. "Melissa claims she knew exactly what she was doing," Danielle replied with a laugh. "Apparently, she'd been plotting to introduce us for months. Remind me to thank her properly." As the evening wound down, Parker and Danielle slipped away from the celebration to stand at the ship's bow, watching the moon's reflection on the water. "Happy?" Parker asked, his arm around her waist. "Completely?" She leaned into him. "And you?" "No regrets about marrying the quiet museum curator? The only regret I have is that we didn't meet sooner." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "But we have the rest of our lives to make up for lost time." 2 years into their marriage, Danielle gave birth to their daughter, Emma, who inherited her mother's thoughtful nature and her father's determination. Parker, true to his word, maintained the balance between work and family, making it home for dinner most nights and reserving weekends for family time. On Emma's first birthday, they took her sailing on a small craft. Parker had designed himself a labor of love that combined his engineering expertise with the classic lines Danielle admired in historical vessels. "She's a natural," Parker observed proudly as Emma squealed with delight at the sensation of the boat cutting through waves. "Of course she is," Danielle replied. "The sea is in her blood from both sides." As they sailed back toward harbor, the three of them silhouetted against the setting sun, Parker reflected on how completely his life had changed since that dinner party. The quiet guest he'd almost overlooked had become the center of his world, teaching the driven CEO that true success couldn't be measured in contracts or profits, but in moments exactly like this one, surrounded by love on the endless sea.